Hi, I'm Norm Perry. Join us.
Good morning. BC's Finance Minister Hugh Curtis presented his $10 billion budget for the year ahead in the House at Victoria yesterday. And Mr. Curtis will tell us that we're on the road to economic renewal and recovery, especially with Expo on our very doorstep at the moment. But I can't resist the remark, all for the good old days, when British Columbia had no direct debt and when every year there were improvements in everybody's standard of living. In our microwave studio in Victoria is Hugh Curtis, the Minister of Finance. Also there, waiting to have his view of the budget presented, is Dave Stupich, the NDP finance critic. That's off the top this morning. Now, Vancouver has become famous or infamous for the coverage by the media of the long lineups at the food banks in BC, in Vancouver. From time to time, people are refused because there are no more packages of food, such as in this story by Clive Jackson a couple of weeks ago.
A sea of food bags, but there still won't be enough to go around. 3,000 people will receive a bag of groceries at one of the 7 food banks in Greater Vancouver this week, but another 375 people eligible for the food bags will be turned away. That's more than ever before. How hard is it to turn someone away who comes to you for food?
It's just excruciatingly painful for everybody that's connected with this to do that. I've been with this organization some time, but I still am appalled that we're having to do this because most of us are facing having just had lunch or going to lunch, and those people go away and they haven't got anything until next week.
And thinking of the food bank as purely an emergency operation, I was surprised to look at the 85 report and find that it has a surplus of accumulated cash of about $180,000. So Sylvia Russell, the director of the food bank, is here today to explain this to us and answer some questions and tell us what kind of food bank it's going to be for the future. Really emergency handout or the building up of an alternate social service? Sylvia Russell is the director of the food bank. And then we're going to go back some, just a minute, 32 years to meet one of the most delightful athletes ever to come to Vancouver. And I'm not going to tell you what happened that day. I'm just going to show you a clip he doesn't want to see. And then I'll tell you who he is.
300. Hallberg is 548. Milligan is 632. Bannister is 329. Those are the names that you have
British
heard
Empire Games, 1954. Believe it or not, I called the race. Imagine me calling a race for a radio station. And you'll see what happens because it is set solidly in stone outside the PNE. Watch for it. Watch for it. There they go. And you'll see in a moment what happened at that particular, in a freeze frame. It is, of course, John Landy, who is the Commissioner of the Australian Pavilion at Expo, and we're going to chat him up towards the end of the program. But first off the top, Finance Minister Hugh Curtis from Victoria.
As this social credit administration enters its second decade in office, we can look back with pride on our accomplishments during a turbulent and difficult period in the world economy.
Probably nothing for the ordinary cameraman.
Gas tax won't go up. Oh, it's company gas, is it? Exclusively?
Yeah, oh no, my wife drives the kids around for
Okay.
to the tune of $100 a month.
I have a little difficulty with that conceptually. I mean, I guess we differ on that.
Well, only 55 minutes to...
The more likely you're what? Well, where do you live? Oh, yeah? Yep. On the lake? Nice. Yeah. Yeah.
I must give you a chance off the top, Mr. Curtis, to tell me, if anything, the good news in your budget. You're predicting an $875 million increase in debt, and you say no pay raises for civil servants. What's good in the budget that can cheer us up, apart from the forthcoming Expo?
Well, Jack, as usual, you are magnificently provocative, and I appreciate that. I think there's a great deal of good news in the budget. Incidentally, just before the commercial break, I was surprised to see the caption on the following part of the program indicating it was a tough times budget. Quite the contrary, and I know you're not responsible for writing the headlines.
Yes, I am.
Okay, well,
I wrote it.
You wrote it. I disagree with it, because it is a budget which shows that the deficit is reducing for the third year in a row. Now, some may argue that it's not reducing sufficiently fast enough, but nonetheless, it is heading downward. That is an important element. It is a budget which does not increase taxes, period. Absolutely. It reduces some taxes, as a matter of fact, and it maintains our vital programs in place. It's a good budget, Mr. Webster, and I think that on reflection you will see that it is. In all respects, as you go through the whole package and see the care with which we have developed it in the interests of a variety of British Columbians, including those who are seeking employment in a number of sectors of this province.
Perhaps you could just give me specifically, we haven't had much help from the feds on job creation, and you, of course, are not dedicated to public works expenditure for job creation. What's the good news for job creation for the unemployed young people?
Well, I think in one area in particular, that would be in forestry, with the Forest Fund, which is very important and which clearly many British Columbians have felt would be appropriate at this particular point in time. You don't simply put a lot of money into the forests. You need people. You need particularly, but not exclusively, younger people, young men and women, who may now be working or may not be working, in all parts of the province.
That's the $20 million to be concentrated in silviculture, and another $50 million of industry, and the feds will kick in.
Yes, and we also look to the forest sector trade union to assist us in this regard as well. We hope that they will come in. It's not for me to say whether they will or whether they won't.
Will there be a specific plan, though, for youngsters to apply for jobs in silviculture?
Well, I think by the very nature of this amount of money being put in it, with a target of 200 million seedlings, which is an attainable target, which is up significantly, 2.7 times over 10 years ago. You don't just suddenly do something miraculously with 200 million seedlings. You need to get them out into the forest areas, the areas for reforestation. You need to have intensive work involved not only with the planting, but additionally with the care, with the thinning, with the great care that those seedlings require in the first years of their lives.
How many jobs? How many jobs?
Well, it's difficult to translate it into a specific number of jobs, but it is a significant move upward in terms of expenditure. The Ministry of Forests, since you asked about employment particularly, the Ministry of Forests, then with the spin-offs which flow from that, from the private sector and from the federal government, you will see a lot of jobs over time in that particular area of program activity.
How about your revenues? I notice you're quite optimistic, for instance, that sales tax, which started at about 80 million many years ago, is going to bring in $1.6 billion this year.
Well, the total revenue expectation is 7.3% up from last year. You speak specifically of sales tax, Jack, and certainly we have seen a very strong and sustained increase in retail sales. Now, not all that we buy retail is taxable, but certainly a significant part of that is. And because retail sales would include food and other things which are not taxable. But we have seen that in a very sharp upward curve, almost like that, Jack, and we see no reason to believe that that will not continue, particularly with the fact that inflation is flat. The announcements today indicating that inflation is down, and down nicely in British Columbia. That also, I think, will give a further boost to consumer spending.
How about businesses? What do they get in this budget, apart from the continued tax cuts on the 3-year program that I believe you brought into effect last year?
1985 was the key budget. This really is a companion piece to the 1985 budget. It corrects certain other anomalies, but I think it's important for those who want to do an objective analysis of the British Columbia budget for 1986-87 to view the two documents in the same context. With respect to taxes, we are cutting the corporation tax, corporation income tax. That is new in the 1986 budget, and that is further stimulus for employment, for job creation, for expansion of the private sector in this province.
How much have you cut the corporation income tax this year?
We actually cut it effective January 1st next year. It's very difficult to cut, as you would appreciate, to cut a tax for other than a calendar year, since we are governed by Revenue Canada in terms of collecting the tax.
I'm already seeing lots of new commercials explaining your budget, although we try to do it from time to time. How much have you increased your commercial account to buy ads on radio and television to make sure your story gets across?
Well, I noted that one or two people were commenting on the expenditures in the government information services. It's important, I'm sure, to outline that the largest part of that, some $1.8 billion, is Expo related, and that is self-explanatory, I think. In terms of ministry advertising, there is virtually no change. In fact, it would be safe to say that there is no change in the amount of money given to the ministries.
I must give you credit for the extra money, the $1.3 billion you're going to put into health and education with a little bit of forestry added. But are these going to be special funds and not really in the budgets, but spent by the discretion of the cabinet in key areas of health and education? In other words, the old W.A.C. Bennett system?
Well, I saw one headline this morning in a Vancouver journal which I think cast them in an entirely incorrect light. The fact is that, as I said yesterday, and as my colleagues, the ministers of post-secondary education, education and health have been saying, we are inviting the community, the British Columbia community, those who are, as an example, involved in the healthcare field, or those who use the healthcare field or have an interest in it, they may be members of a hospital board, to give us ideas with respect to how the health system can adjust to an aging population, which is a fact, how it can move into new areas of care or preventive work. And so we're really saying, in the case of post-secondary education and health, over to you, to those of you who work in the system, who use the system, who believe in the system, tell us, the government, tell us what areas you think we should, areas of activity.
But that, on a basic parliamentary democracy point, does that not take away from the House the right to vote on how that money is going to be spent, because you're going to do it arbitrarily from your special funds?
I think that glosses over a couple of key points, Jack, and I have great respect for the legislative process, and I think you would have to admit that if you cared at all to do so. The point is that those funds are now the subject of bills in the legislature.
Oh, they're covered by bills.
They're covered by bills. Therefore, the ministers concerned, and I, and any other minister who may want to participate in the debate or be challenged in the debate will have the opportunity to do so. Those bills are in the House, so it's not something that is happening off in in the cloistered cabinet room. Rather, it will be dealt with right in the Legislative Assembly.
That's good to know, Mr. Curtis. Now, you accused me of wrongly writing a headline, Tough Time.
No, I didn't. I thought it was an incorrect headline.
All right, it is a tough budget for the civil service, is it not? No pay increases, not a sou for government or Crown Corporation employees.
Well, Jack, look, we've come out of a very severe recession. Your viewers know that, and indeed all British Columbians know that. It was tough. We didn't plan it. It happened to us. World events brought it upon us. Suddenly, there was not the demand for a number of things which we have been exporting for many, many years. We're moving out of that. Okay, as a result of the recession, we did suffer serious employment difficulties. We see employment increasing. We saw it in 1985. We are saying, and I think that it is a fundamentally reasonable and sound proposition, it is this, that if we have to watch the limited resources available to government, then let us put what money we can, what we do have of taxpayers' money, into creating more jobs through the private sector particularly, but not exclusively, through the private sector. And therefore, if you have limited amounts of money, those who are working have to recognize that this government's main thrust, and I believe the thrust of the majority of British Columbians, is to create jobs for those who don't have them. Now, that's the fundamental reason behind this. You can get rid of all the rhetoric, you can get rid of all the criticism, the people who would not accept anything that this government does. I think the reasonable, fair-minded British Columbian will say, that is fair, that is appropriate at this point in time. If you have a job, then fine, we have to limit the amount of money you will get in terms of salary increases, in order that someone without a job will have that job.
My thanks to Hugh Curtis, and the best of luck, Mr. Curtis. We all need it, and Expo will be a magnificent success.
Expo will be fantastic.
And I'll be back with my thanks to Mr. Curtis, and I'll be back with Dave Stupich, the other side of the political coin, after the break.
You can hear only one side of it, eh?
Yeah, it's okay. I'm used to one-sided arguments.
Oh, well.
Okay.
Whatever you say. Or whenever Jack says. Yeah.
Dave Stupich is the NDP finance critic. Now, Mr. Stupich, you probably heard Mr. Curtis. Is it a tough times budget, or is it the kind of good, reasonable, sane budget that you would do because of our shortfall, our shortage in revenues?
Jack, it's a rehash of the 1982 budget, which you'll recall was the last budget we saw until the election of May 1983. And at that time, all kinds of promises were made and rosy forecasts about the future. They predicted at that time a break-even position. They ended the year with a deficit of $980 million. The first deficit in the history of the province in some 30 years, incidentally. And they're doing the same thing this time. They're overestimating revenues and underestimating expenditures.
But they are estimating a deficit of $875 million, no kidding.
And they're saying it's a reduction of deficit. The last year they predicted the deficit would be $890 million, so it's a reduction of $15 million. Now, I think that figure was arrived at first, and then they produced the revenue and expenditure figures that netted out at a deficit of 875, so they could say it was marginally lower than last year's deficit.
But you're the first man to concede that any finance minister doing this budget with our economy as it is would have just as tough a time, and he's got no spare money to play with.
And it's his own fault, or the government's fault at least. They started all this in 1983. I saw a very interesting report of a speech by the publisher of the Financial Times recently, who said that prospects for Canada as a whole are improving and looking good. But how can Canada as a whole do well when BC, one of the leading provinces, is dragging back, is holding back the economy of the whole country because of what's happened here in the past 3 years?
What are you talking about, the restraint program?
The restraint program. You can call it restraint if you like, Jack, but it was really a program of revenge against trade unions, a program to show British Columbians who controlled BC. It did nothing for the economy, nothing good, that is. It did bad. It destroyed whatever investor confidence there was in British Columbia. Told people, don't come to BC because this is where the real fight is going on between government and unions and business. Stay away from BC.
Oh,
now, that was what he did in '83, Jack.
He didn't kill the mining industry. Your government was accused of killing the mining industry with your unwise royalties.
Of course, it was accused of it, Jack. There were only 2 mines closed during our time in office, and both of those closed because the ore bodies ran out. There have been 13 metal mines closed since the Social Credit was re-elected in December of 1975.
But at the same time, we can point to the lumber industry where the output is greater with 20,000 men less. Now, who's to blame for that? The government?
And the IWA has always cooperated in technological improvement, and that is good. The fact that we are producing more lumber with less men, and if we could produce even more with even less men, so much the better. But what about the unemployment? What are they doing to try to put these people back to work? In Ontario, Jack, have you seen the reports that they're going to start advertising across Canada and likely into Europe to find building tradesmen because they don't have enough people to build the buildings they want built? What's happening in BC? Our workers are going to Ontario.
What would you do, though? You kindly give me something which you would do tomorrow, which would produce, we're going to get lots of fairly lowly paid Expo jobs. You kindly give me your formula whereby we can put 20,000 or 30,000 construction workers at union rates and IWA men and pulp workers at union rate back on the job tomorrow.
The first thing we have to do, Jack, is to sit down with the municipalities and talk about their programs. And we've talked about this for some time now. Public works, yes. Everything that's happening in BC right now is public works. There's nothing positive happening that isn't public works.
You would borrow money for public works.
What I would do is borrow money to produce the projects that we need done in every municipality in the province. And that in itself would generate economic activity, would increase investor confidence in BC, would increase the confidence of our own people, and would start a self-generated increase in productivity in the province that would drag Canada as a whole forward.
And you would tell me now that you could raise enough money from somewhere to give the teachers the raises they want, to give the civil servants the raises they want, or would you agree that Curtis is right when he says no increases for those Crown people and government people employed create jobs for unemployed? Do you agree with Curtis on that?
Jack, not even TV interviewers are going to get all the increases they want regardless of who's in office. There is a solid case to be made for certain increases, and that's a matter of sitting down and deciding what those are. No one can have everything they want, neither you nor I nor anybody else. But all of us can do better if the economy as a whole in BC were doing better, and it would do better if these people get out of office and let someone in who has some positive ideas for the future, would try to build confidence rather than threatening people, threatening trade unions, threatening professional groups, refusing to meet with them to discuss their problems. That kind of government is something of the past that doesn't belong in BC in 1986.
And one thing you would do right now, I suppose, in contradiction to the social credit, is sit down and negotiate all Indian land claims at once.
We should certainly sit down and negotiate, and we should make sure that the federal government, the provincial government, and the representatives of the Indians are sitting down at the same table. Quit arguing about the size of the table and the shape of it. Get the 3 groups there, sit down and hammer this out. It has to be resolved if BC is going to prosper. So much of the land is under question. How can investors come in and talk about developing land in BC when they don't know whether or not they might be caught in the middle of a jurisdictional fight?
Right. Do you praise him for his $1.3 billion extra money for health and education? Surely you approve of that.
$1.3 billion extra, did you say?
Well, that's
I haven't seen that in the budget.
That's the money allocated, the increases in spending and health
over
spending.
5 years. Over 5 years. That's not in the budget, Jack. That's forecasts of what's going to happen somewhere down the line. What they're doing in this particular budget is taking money out of healthcare programs, taking money out of educational programs, and setting up special funds that, for example, Segretti told quite plainly to the voters, as is recorded in the minutes of the meeting, if you want this money, then you treat your cabinet minister properly, because the cabinet ministers are going to determine where and when and how much these slush funds are going to be handed out. Rather than having programs that have been voted on by the legislature, the money is being pulled out of the programs and given to the cabinet minister to allocate for political purposes rather than to suit the needs of the people of British Columbia.
Final question. With all your vast experience, give me the date of the election. Will it come when the polls say that he's leading, or will it come before the end of Expo?
It'll come when the polls say that he is on the upswing rather than on the downswing, whenever that may be. But I will say, Jack, that the voters of the province will never know what is the true deficit position with respect to this budget until after the next election. But the election could be 14, 15 months away, or 4 months.
My thanks to Dave Stupich.
Thank you.
NDP Finance Critic. Next, we're going to interview Sylvia Russell, the director of the Greater Vancouver Food Bank Society, after the break.
It's a wonder we haven't had a conversation about this a long time ago, Jack. You know, I mean, because there's so much to talk about. We could spend 2 hours.
I always felt uneasy about the food bank.
Well, everybody does, because it shouldn't be here. I mean, if you didn't, you wouldn't be sensitive.
There's no doubt about it. The food bank depots and distributions are obviously needed in British Columbia because people don't go and line up for food unless they need it. There might be a little bit of unnecessary collection, but very small indeed. But here is Sylvia Russell, who is the director of the food bank. And Sylvia, just a couple of weeks ago, we ran a program in which we showed the empty shelves. Heartbreaking story, 357 people turned away. And then I see your annual report for 1985, and what do I see? I see that not only did you have a surplus at the end of 1984 of $160,000, you had a surplus of $180,000 at the end of 85. Now, how could you stand there and say, we're turning away these hungry people, when in fact you had lots of money in the kitty to buy more food?
One of the things about the distribution, Jack, is that you never know from one Wednesday to the next how many people will come. And you're also restricted by the number of people you have and the facility you have as to how many bags you can actually turn out. Now, we at one time considered our absolute maximum was 2,500, and then 3,000 people were coming. We said, okay, we'll squeeze out another 500 bags each week. So 3,000 is all we can do. And I don't think we should feel guilty about that. I think it just points to the question as to whose responsibility is to feed hungry people anyway.
Now, I don't want to be unkind to you in any way, shape, or form, but I felt when I saw this as if we are being misled about the function and operation of the food bank. Do you understand why I thought that?
Well, possibly, because we only have a statement formally that comes out once a year, but our books are always open to the public at any time.
No, I realize that, and you've told me everything I've wanted to ask you up to now about these particular things. But here we have these kind of heart-rending pleas for more money, and there is money there. So obviously what you're doing is running a continuing operation in business to which you see no end. And are you keeping money in reserve for all future operations?
Well, exactly. Right now there's a balance in the reserve of $130,000, but it costs us to run the operation, to buy food and so on, $60,000 plus per month if no money came in, and as you know, we have no guaranteed income. So we have to have some reserve. Otherwise, we might be faced with telling 3,000 people out there, sorry, there's no food today, and turning away 3,000 people, and we feel much responsibility that that doesn't happen. And one thing the financial statement does not do is talk about the tons and tons of food that come in from people through the food boxes or whatever way.
Let me give you a little...
So this is as part of the picture, you see.
So you tell me, it costs you $60,000...
An average per month.
Per month. That's $700,000 per year if you're going full out.
Right.
Right? But you only get, in total donations and grants, less than $1 million. Right? So that means that most of your food, therefore, comes from donations.
Right. That's the bulk of the operation.
About 80% of your food comes from donations,
Right.
is that right?
Yes.
So it's a very big operation as such. But look at this. In 1984, the purchase of food cost $280,000. And your administrative expenses of depot costs of rent and administration were $170. In 85, you spent twice as much for food, and your costs on top of that are $400,000. Are you spending too much on administration costs when you could be spending more money on food? Depot costs.
Based on the volume of food that's going out, we gave out over 130,000 bags. The costs of producing that are very low. Now, you mentioned the depot costs. The depot costs, the highest cost we have, which you'll see on that more expansive statement, are in the area of transportation. We have trucks on the road constantly picking up that food and delivering it. And so that, as you will see, makes up the major part of our expenditures in depot.
Well, you have 111,000 in salaries for all your people.
Yes, when we had a full staff subsidized by the federal government.
People will want to ask me, do you pay big money to people?
No, our wages are based on United Way criteria, and are in all cases are less than what are being paid through United Way.
Including yours?
Yes, exactly.
Can I ask you how much?
No, I never tell my salary, but I will tell you that it's lower than any other executive director in the United Way chain, and we try to base it on a legitimate set of criteria.
To be about 50,000.
Oh, I wish it were, Jack.
No,
then I could take a vacation.
No, but this is the kind of thing which people are about to ask.
well
now,
below that.
Another nag of mine, I saw John Turner going after the government on the fact that they had not renewed the grant, this $163,000 grant, correct?
Yes, we needed that grant.
And you were complaining too that they had let you down by not renewing the grant, right?
Right.
But you knew that was a one-shot grant which couldn't be renewed.
That particular Canada Works grant could not be renewed, but I didn't at any time assume that there would be no government funds anywhere for groups like ourselves, whether they be Katimavik or ourselves. We assumed that because we were performing a legitimate service that there would be federal funds available.
Although on that thing you had been told that you would have to secure alternative funding sources for the future, right?
Yes, presuming that there weren't funds in other categories. We were dealing specifically with Canada Works 1985 when that was discussed.
So actually now your bag limit, providing you have enough money, will be kept at 3,000.
Yes. Actually, it's more than 3,000 because we have a single parent program, and
yes, you've got 7 depots, 7 centers.
So if there's 3,000 on Wednesdays, but we'd like to expand that single parent depot because that's where the need is. However, it does present problems logistically and for a lot of reasons.
But don't you think you should tell the public when you make appeal for funds that your maximum limit is 3,000 and that you won't be handing out more, otherwise you'll go broke?
Well, that's right, and I try to tell the story, but as you know, there's limitations as to what story can be told in the limited space you have sometimes.
When you turn away people without food, do you have, in fact, the warehouse will say, stocked with food for the next week's packaging?
On an average, we may have almost a distribution of canned goods, etc., 1 week in advance. But other than at Christmas time, we never have a full stocked warehouse. One of the things about the statement that's interesting, you're seeing that December influx of donations, which is a one-time thing, and then months like September, hardly anything comes in. And so you are having to deal with very fallow months and with one significant month, which happens to be December, and everything that implies as far as donations.
Now, what about the future of the food bank? I see some references in here in the report which indicate a kind of change of direction. Maybe I'm just out of it. It says here, all these people lining up for food. Do we continue to crank out more food bags each week? Or do we try and change the inequalities within the system? Is the food bank becoming a politically motivated operation?
We've always had an advocacy policy right from the very start, and that was based on the fact that although we felt it was our mandate to give out food to people that were hungry, we had to learn what the long-term solutions might be, and we have consistently and emphatically ask community groups and government to confer with us on these issues so that we aren't asking people indefinitely to come to food banks, line up for a meager bag of groceries and say that's good enough. And we will continue to state that and hope that sometime we are going to get together on this issue, because things out there are very upsetting right now. A lot of people are very desperate, and I think we're sitting on the top of a social volcano right now.
Yeah, but you're not trying to turn it into an activist agency, are you?
No, we're just telling what we know to be true, and that can be accused of being political, and in fact, it is political in the small p sense.
And you would concede that some people have been misled, accidentally perhaps, by the fact that when the shelves are empty, you have in fact quite a chunk of money left, which you could spend at that time and put the whole thing out of existence.
If you had notice, you could. But also, I want to emphasize that the food bags are made up primarily of food donations plus cash purchases. So you always have to have that food coming in the boxes or wherever they come in. It's just not a cash operation at all. And that reserve is very important, because I would hate to see what the consequences would be if any time I had to, a week ahead of time, say, look, there's no food, we have no reserve.
In other words, it would be impossible for you to make an appeal each week for money and food to feed those who come.
Well, people would get tired of hearing about us, and certainly the people on our board of directors are all very honorable, responsible people, and they keep us very much on target. Otherwise, we would be very open to criticism at any time.
More with Sylvia Russell and your questions after the break. I see here, said he, nagging Sylvia Russell, director of the food bank, that it would cost you about $130,000. Cost you a lot of money to close down, wouldn't it?
Oh yes, because we have leases on the building, expenses that are committed to, and we are a legitimate fiscally responsible group, so you have to earmark some funds for that.
Perhaps that's where I misunderstood your operation.
Well, you see that half of that that overage there is earmarked for rental. You see,
rental $60,000, staff costs $14,000, operating costs during phase out. Would you like to phase out next year when Expo's here, or before Expo comes?
It was the consensus of a group of us that met last June that we had wanted to phase out as of June 1986, 1 year from that conference, providing that other measures were put into place so we wouldn't be necessary. But here it is almost summer and nothing has happened, so we're in the middle of this very chaotic situation.
The food bank is still necessary?
Yes, because a lot of the people that come to us, that's there in several weeks of the month.
Mind
that's
you,
the only way.
don't check the qualifications of people who come, although I take the position that people wouldn't come unless they wanted the food very badly.
Well, I don't think most of us would go to a food line unless we really needed it, and that's what we go on.
It's quite obvious you must be getting close to how much in donations of food?
Well, if you look at the bags that we gave out, which would be 130,000 in 85, and you multiply that between $15 and $20 per bag, you can see what kind. We're talking about a $2 million operation, plus $2 to $2.5 million worth of retail priced food goes out of that.
I see that. I can see in 84 and 85 when you didn't send out that much of a different level of bags, 108,000 or 130,000. Your costs went up more than 100%. Your depot costs and other costs went up from 92 to 243 to 234.
We actually had more staff, and we did pay a portion of the federal grant, but the transportation area, and then of course we had to put in another connected warehouse to store some of the food. The space.
How was your Orpheum deal? Was that a flop?
It wasn't a flop.
That was the auction.
There was an art auction and a musical show. I think one of the questions that needs to be asked about that, why is the food bank having to put on a concert like that? I mean, impresarios are out there, but they don't usually connect with food banks. The problem is that we felt responsibly that we had to raise money through some special event because our federal funding was cut off, and we could have earmarked, if we had made a lot of money on that, towards salaries, because it was fully understood by the people that came that we were raising administrative funds in that way.
Just can't quite get the split between, although the auditor says that because he can't value the value of donations of food, it's impossible to
Yeah, it is. You can't possibly put an inventory.
So what happens if you don't get government grants now? You'll be left with these heavy costs and you go down the tube.
We just have to do things like benefits or whatever we can to raise money to keep the staff we have. But as you know, we have cut the staff substantially, realizing that we cannot afford the staff that we had last year. And we felt at that time that was about the minimum that we could survive with. So we have people doing double duty all the time at the food bank.
So the broad picture is that in '85, when you get you spent $500,000 on buying food and got considerable donations of food, we don't quite know how much, that your costs were close to half of the cost of the food. Depot cost and administration. $400,000 is against $500,000. And it's essential for you to have these surpluses all the time so you can plan for the months ahead.
Oh yes, because it would be irresponsible not to have some. Because we have no guaranteed income. The people that donate at will, and we encourage them to do so, but there's no guarantee anyone's going to give us anything.
But the public must understand that when the shelves are empty, you still have money, but you need that money for your administrative costs, your depot costs, and your purchases to go with your donations.
Yes, to purchase the produce, the meat, the etc. that we buy.
I don't know. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have several points that I'd like to make. One is Sylvia says her books are open to the public at any time, and yet when you ask her salary, she won't say what it is. Now,
I think she should, but I'm not going to chase her on it.
Well, I think that, you know, are the books open or aren't they open? And if they're open, why can't we know what her salary is?
Well, when I've divulged my salary in other years, I've usually had some people that think I make far too little, and some people think I'm too much, so it's a no-win situation. And as director, I think there are some personal things that one has a right to keep to themselves. But if anyone wants to come down and look at our salary budget, you'll see how low it really is.
Well, I beg to differ. When you work for an organization and you ask the public for money, I believe when the public asks you what your salary is, that you have an obligation to tell those people what your salary is. And I hear a lot of double talk today. One of the things you're saying is that you, on one hand, you have more staff, so you need more money. But when Jack puts a certain question to you, you say, well, we've had to cut our staff. Your costs have gone up because you have more staff, and yet you have...
No, I was pointing to last year, saying our staff costs were up because we had a government grant and we had to pay some of the costs of that. The costs will now go down because we have fewer people.
And because you don't have that government grant.
Oh, and we don't have the government grant.
And it's obvious you're not going to get it again, even no matter what Turner asks in the House, and therefore you're going to be in real trouble. But maybe you've come to a state where your fixed costs are too high for what you get in the way of grants and donations.
Well, I think our fixed costs are
very
low.
Excuse me. That's another point. I would like to know how much does it cost? I'm hearing very large numbers.
No. I can tell you exactly how much it cost in '85. $500,000 for food, $400,000 for costs and administration.
Yeah, but isn't that too high for a volunteer organization?
Balanced by donations of food, which are not
and
shown.
that is the crucial point.
Have a lot of volunteers filling those bags. They have many, many volunteers filling the bags. So I'm saying that perhaps we should look at the cost. If we're spending a certain...
Fair enough, Mama. I think you've made your point well, and I'll pass on. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm on Gain, and I live in an area where there aren't any food banks, and my opinion of the whole situation is that I think they should be done away with, because all it's doing is allowing the government to slough off and not give people the proper amount of money to live on.
I fully agree with what you're saying, but because I am frustrated and disappointed, particularly in this recent budget, could you tell me what we can do other than vocalize the frustration that we have that we're still in existence after 3 years? What can we do when we don't get attention paid to the problem?
Yeah, well, here am I paying attention to this morning because I felt we were being misled. Shelves empty, $189,000 in the kitty. Mm-hmm. That was a mistake, don't you think so?
Oh, yes. I think that what we weren't seeing here, Jack, was the huge commodity of food, and that's why if you look at that commodity of food that goes out, our expenses to expedite that through the system are very small.
After the break. After the break. I think I understand it better now with Sylvia Russell. You see, between '84 and '85, their costs doubled. Partly because administering the federal grant, but people have got to understand that you are in the way of becoming a formal agency with salaries and benefits and staff and losing the flavour of a real emergency operation for people who are really hungry. Is that right?
Well, I think we've become almost a business, and we despair about that because our intent in the beginning was to be a short-term emergency that would allow government to move in with adequate assistance and we could phase out very quickly. But it's now, I'm going into my 4th year with this organization, and there's no hope in sight for our organization, but most importantly, very little hope for those people who are looking for some real
well, there's
bright light
nothing in the budget of British Columbia today for increase in welfare or Canada Assistance Plan payments.
And there's also a reduction in the total budget for MHR, even though more people are going on to welfare. So the only thing I can see is that what is happening, and I know this because I've seen the sheets, the MHR is giving out lists of places like food banks and soup kitchens where people can go for food. And
Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
See, my concern is the food bank appears to be a very inefficient way of duplicating an already existing food distribution system, i.e. Safeway, Overweighty, and Save-On, and so on. Would it not be far more cost-effective to distribute vouchers valid at one of these food stores, cut the $400,000 overhead figure plus the $100,000 salary figure you quoted down to virtually zero, and increase the amount of food available by a like amount, i.e. roughly double the amount of food available for distribution?
All right, just a minute. Let me ask that question again. Would it not be much better for the hungry people if you took your 800,000 in donations and gave them certificates to go to Save-On, Safeway, Woodward's, or whatnot? Would that not be much more efficient and remove the stigma of lining up at a food bank?
Well, it would remove the stigma of lining up at the food bank, but the problem is that the money that we spend to purchase food is all below wholesale. If we took that money and bought supermarket vouchers, we would be paying retail costs, and we could get into difficulty.
You would have saved in '85, instead of 400,000 administration costs and 500,000 for food, you might have had 750,000 for food. Surely that's the answer, Sylvia Russell. Close it down. Keep an office organization for issuing food vouchers.
But then what about the food that people give, which is the primary source of the food that we distribute, the contributions?
You're saying you get more than 814,000 than the cash donations, you also get food donations.
Well, of course, if we're giving out $2.5 million worth of groceries and we're only spending $800,000 on wholesale food, well, then you can see that there's the majority of the supplies come from people who just give very generously.
What is the markup on food? What is the difference between the wholesale price and the retail price?
It differs with each item and what the value in the marketplace is, but I can tell you that we've spent months and a lot of connections with food brokers to be sure that we get below wholesale. We never buy retail.
No, I'm not debating that.
No, we don't know, sir, but I think you put your finger on the nub of the problem. That really has got to be the nub of the problem. If your administrative costs keep going up, as they've doubled from 84 to 85, surely you'll have to go to a voucher system, which would, of course, be duplicating what human resources should be duplicated.
That's exactly the point. But a food stamp system is much better than food lines. That's obvious to all of us.
Well, are you really planning to wrap up the food bank? Can you go on like this with doubling costs?
Well, the predicament that we're in is that there are these people, numbers of them, unemployed people who need food help. That's the mandate that we tried to follow through on. We tried to give that food to those people when they needed it, and that's now. And then work towards the long-term solutions. But no long-term solutions are being developed anywhere at any government level, and we can't seem to get anybody to confer with us about those. So we're at a stalemate situation. There's no question about that.
Well, you can be regarded as you can see the politicians, you would embarrass them with your political lobbying. You're embarrassing social credit for a start.
Well, if anyone is embarrassed by hearing what's happening out there, I'm sorry about that, but I can't do anything about the experience that we're going through.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I would like to highly compliment the food bank. I am a donor and not a receiver. I think they've done a tremendous job, and I think they should be highly complimented. I would like to suggest that in the various outlets where the grocery stores are kind enough to have a box for contributions, that if those boxes were a little more obvious, the average person who goes in to shop scarcely notices they're there. The other thing I'd like to say is that the appalling indifference of this social credit government, who has enough money for every damn circus that can be in sight, and not enough for food for people. It is disgusting, absolutely disgusting.
Thank you, ma'am. She said it well. Go ahead from Salt Spring.
Yes. Well, you know, it's no one ever wants to see anybody go hungry, and I'd be the first one to want a food bank. But the question is whether or not most people really need food. I remember when I was...
What's the question you're asking? Are you saying that...
When I walked by one of the lines and I started speaking to some of the people that were waiting in this line, because she said no one would ever wait in line for food unless they really needed it, they offered to sell me. They said, we'll wait in line, get the bag, and sell it to you. All they wanted was booze and cigarettes. So the idea that everybody stands in line because they're hungry is probably less than 10%.
What's your response to that? That's a commonly held allegation by some people. I don't happen to accept it myself.
I don't think there's a system that prevails that doesn't have a certain amount of rip-off, but the persons that would attempt that are probably around, as we have estimated, 3%. So if we're feeding 97% of people who really need food, I don't think that that's a bad record.
Go ahead from Monte Creek.
Good morning, Jack. Good morning, Sylvia.
Morning.
I must agree with the previous caller. I'm an ex-prison correctional food service officer, and although I think your intentions are good and the food bank are good, I think the whole method of distribution is very, very poor. I would like to see the provincial government buy this food in bulk and let several of these hundreds of inmates that are sat in the cells doing nothing prepare this food and distribute it either to a food bank or to a warehouse in bulk.
Okay, but your solution is totally impractical because of the attitude of the government in Victoria. I'll take one more short segment after the break. Couple of basic questions again. Is it not a fact that you're in danger of becoming a United Way bureaucracy where your expense ratio to what you do is going to be too high? When I look at all these in here, 110,000 in salaries, 35,000 transportation, depot equipment, 12,000, depot rent, extra storage, and you have some leases. You've really become, and I'm not knocking your work, but you've become an industry which is misunderstood by the public.
Well, I think maybe misunderstood to a point, and I hope we have clarified some of it. But I do think that you cut where you can, and so we cut staff, so our costs will go down. That does mean that probably our organization runs on fewer staff than any type of operation in the city. But the problem, Jack, is not whether if we're going to become a full-time bureaucracy, the decision for that, unfortunately, does not really lie just with ourselves. As you pointed out, we hope for long-term solutions from government level, and when those come about, we'll just be too happy to close down within, as I say, we need at least 2 months, 3 months to phase out.
Are you going to decide to close down in 86? I mean, make a decision to close and stay open in the coming year, 86. Says the year of 86 will be a year of serious decision for us. I mean, are you going to continue? You're not going to get many more Canada Works programs.
That's right.
You're not going to get anything from the provincial government. You only got 6,700 from the city of Vancouver. You're depending entirely on donations and building up. You're not getting anything from United Way, are you?
No, we're not a United Way agency.
You're not a United Way agency.
No.
So it's a bleak future, really, isn't it?
So then the decision really lies at the community level as to whether they want food banks to continue or whether they don't, because all we really are is an organization that does what the community allows us to do with their donations. And if they decide that this isn't what they want, they just don't have to continue funding us. But I hope that that isn't just a flat statement and it doesn't mean anything, because I want it to mean that if people feel food banks shouldn't be here, what should be happening, and then the public will determine whether we have policy
Well, I mean,
changes.
my own political solution is perfectly simple. I think that where people are hungry, the Ministry of Human Resources should supply the vouchers for those people.
Well, that's what Gain says in the
But they don't
policy.
do it. But the government will say, well, lots of people get it who don't need that food. They're just queuing up to sell it, as that guy said. You and I know that's not true, especially for the people with children, right?
No, well, that's just scapegoating the people most in need, and I resent that when I hear
Are
it.
your books open at all times for looking at by responsible people?
That's true. Always have been and always will be.
And your salary is available for anybody who wants to, a responsible person who comes down to say, I want to know what you make from the books.
Exactly.
Have you any other well-paid people on the staff?
I don't think any of us are well paid because the commitment that we have to this organization goes beyond the salaries that we earn. Otherwise,
What
it's
do you
too
do
difficult.
normally, Sylvia? I mean, when you're not doing the food banks.
I'm just an average person, Jack, like anyone else out there, just doing a job that has to be done.
Yeah, but you were in business before this.
No, I'm just one of those former housewives who get moving into political circles.
How did you get into this thing? Oh, are you tagged with a party?
No, and I think the whole democratic system means that you are part of the body politic, and that by that, when I use that word political, I have to be careful because I don't mean in a partisan way.
I thought Turner's question indicated maybe you were an active liberal.
No, I'm not an active. I'm an activist, but not an active politician.
Are you tied up with any particular groups in town?
No, just social and cultural groups. That's all.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Sylvia.
Yes.
Yes, I'm. Excuse me. I'm a handicapped person. And I was wondering, isn't there any provision for a person, a handicapped person, that doesn't have to stand at apparently an hour and a half or 2 hours in line? I'm not able to stand up more than 5 or 10 minutes at a time. And I've never even once been to a food bank yet myself, proudly. But there are times that I've needed to go, and there's no possible way I could stand in a big long lineup for an hour and a half.
Okay, that's a fair question.
Is there any provision made for people like that?
That brings up a very important issue, and that is what we show in terms of unemployed, hungry people is just the tip of the iceberg. There's hundreds and hundreds of people like this gentleman who cannot get to the food lines for a variety of reasons, and where there's not a lot that we can do. However, we do have a very responsible church organization that's connected with us, that if there is a definite need, we do some limited home delivery. Now, I'm going out on a limb saying this because we cannot handle a huge group.
You can't put up your administrative expenses or your depot costs anymore. You'll be using half of every dollar for administration. At the moment, you're using 40% of the money received for administration.
Well, you're showing that based on the money that we're coming, but you have to base the costs on the total volume, including transferring that food that comes in into the hands of people who need it. And if you ignore that part, you're going to give a distorted picture of how
Sylvia,
much we
I have
spend.
a better understanding of the food bank round. You correct me if I'm wrong. You started as a very small organization. The response and the need was apparently terrific. You began to get money from governments, from donations, and you have built up a food bank, not empire, a food bank organization, which requires to run each year $400,000 before you cope with the food side of it, correct?
That's right.
And that puts a slightly different face on it. So therefore, when you appeal for donations or for food, or when you say the shelves are empty in the future, people will understand better.
I hope they do, and if they have any questions, I hope that they will take the time to phone me and get those questions answered.
My thanks for coming this morning. I'm sorry you wouldn't tell me your salary. Not that I want to know, but it's
Well, you have to have some things that are kept private, Jack.
Not
I think it's
when you're dealing with an agency.
Well, I checked with my board on that issue, and the majority said that that's your private business. But if anybody wants to ask me personally and in a responsible manner privately, I'll be glad to tell them. They'll be surprised.
My thanks to Sylvia Russell. Best of luck. The food bank will be here in '86 unless you run out of money. Is that right?
I guess so, unless we have some government measures that move in and we can close down within a few months. And that's what we would love to do.
And it'll cost you a good buck or two to close with your leases.
Well, yes, there are commitments we have.
After the break, John Landy.
Right.
John Landy is one of those people whom you feel you've known for 1,000 years. Oh. Well, not quite 1,000 years. But I'm not going to talk about that 358.7 caper. And you don't want to talk about the 350.
No, not at all.
When did you last run a mile?
I reckon 30 years ago.
Don't you jog every day?
No, I'm too old for that.
Hey,
I can't even run a message.
But give me some advice. I always think that those idiots who jog every day get those people who jog for fitness every day wreck their kneecaps and don't do themselves any good. Would you endorse that?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I do think there's a real problem here, and the problem is that you give up when you're about 25, and then you suddenly get the idea at 45 that you can run again. I see these fellas running around our place in Melbourne, and you know, they're very unfit, terribly unfit. They haven't got their weight down to run, really, and they don't know how to run. I feel like getting them into my car and taking them home. But really, I think the problem about it is, Jack, that we don't continually exercise. You know, we give up and we get fatter, and you know, the whole business about running is there's a fair bit of jarring in it, and we run on bad surfaces. So generally speaking, I think you can run till you're a great age, but we don't go about it the right way.
That's not why you came in here this morning, to talk about that day in the British Empire Games. Right. You are the Commissioner of the Australian Pavilion at Expo.
That's right, Jack.
What are we going to see?
Well, we've got something outside called Australia 2. That was our winning yacht, of course, in the America's Cup in a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. So we've got that out, and that'll be a replica of that, full-scale replica, and you know, it'll be about over 100 feet high, and that'll be a real feature. And we've gone to an audio-visual presentation, Jack, in our pavilion, where we're going to show aspects of, I guess, history, sport and culture. And of course, we're going to be talking about the themes of Expo, which are transport and communication.
Well, one of the great marks that Australia has made on the world's cultural stage in recent years are all these magnificent movies.
Yeah.
Are you going to give us anything of that?
Yes. In fact, we'll be using the movies, which have been all donated to us, as part of the historical display. And in fact, that's the way we're going to do it. We're using Mel Gibson, who of course is well known as an actor.
Oh, he's one of the most famous actors in the world today.
Yes, well, Mel's donated his time, and he's sort of introducing the historical section, and we're using 6 well-known Australian films, including Gallipoli and other ones.
Mel won't be here in person.
No, he'll be in the video.
But that'd be great, you know.
Sure.
Who knows, he might drop in. The only Australian movie actor I ever met once in Sydney in 1949 was Chips Rafferty.
Oh yes, big tall chap, yeah.
Now what else are we going to do for Australia? It's a fairly big pavilion you've got.
Yes, it is. It's about a 6-module pavilion, and well, it'll take about 25 minutes to go right through the audio-visual. We'll have something in excess of 120 individual projectors, and we've also got an entertainment facility there, which we'll use as well.
That's terrific. How old are you now, John Landy?
Well, I hate to say it, Jack, I'm 55.
You don't look it. I mean, matter of fact, you don't look much older than you did when you...
Except I had hair.
Did you?
Yeah,
did you
a little bit.
And you haven't put on any weight?
Well, I have put on a little bit, yeah. It doesn't show.
No, it doesn't show at all. And you keep fit?
Yeah, I do. We've got some farming interests, and I do the gardening and that sort of thing, but I don't play any sport, I regret.
Was that not as a decision, just because of...
Well, I haven't got time, and also I do find the running pretty hard. I find it difficult with my legs nowadays. I don't stand up to it too well.
John Landy, the Commissioner of the Australian Pavilion at Expo, and he wants to have a chat with you about anything you like about Australia. We won't restrict it to Australians, and if Jacko Jackson phones, I'll cut him off. And I'll be back with John Landy after the break.
Expo 86, 42 days to go.
Number 3.
Well, John, it's your show from here on in.
Oh,
John Landy. I should really call him Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner General.
Mr. Commissioner, go ahead, Mr. Commissioner General.
Yes, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you.
I'm so glad to see you in Vancouver again.
Right.
I'll never forget that race. Never. I think you should have won it, actually. You shouldn't have turned around to find out where Bannister was. Lost too much energy doing that.
I don't think that's the reason. I think I was beaten by a better man on the day.
But, Mr. Can't I ask you whether or not... Didn't you run the 4-minute mile in Australia, which wasn't official? You actually ran the 4-minute mile before the good Dr. Bannister.
Oh, I'd like to think that, but that's not true. No, he ran the first 4-minute mile, I think it was May the 5th or May the 6th, 1954, and I ran the second one in Turku in Finland in on June the 21st, 1954. I certainly didn't run one before he did.
Oh, so but you have run the 4-minute mile.
Yeah, I did run it 6 times.
Oh, right. What's happened to Mr. Landy? What's happened to all our imports that we're not seeing anymore? The pineapple and the sugar and the currants and all the fruit that we used to get from Australia before the war, the last war.
And the bully
beef. What's happened to all those exports that are no longer coming from Australia?
Well, I think there's some sugar coming in and there's some dried fruit and we have tinned fruit, but I guess the markets aren't there. It's all a matter of markets. We've got the capacity to sell those products, but I'm not quite sure why they don't come here. We do sell a lot of products to Canada in the food line, but I guess it's just a matter of supply and demand. We've got the supply.
My favourite was bully beef.
Yes, we even got Australian bully beef, but the currants, Australian currants. So you had the market then?
Yeah, well, maybe they'll get. If you would ask for them in the stores, they might send out the odd packet for you. Okay, that's how to get stuff in the stores. Go ahead, please.
Right.
Hello, Mr. Commissioner. I'd like to know if during Expo will the Australian Pavilion have a feature on the Great Barrier Reef?
No, we won't have a feature on the Great Barrier Reef, but there will be some segments of it shown in an audiovisual presentation involving a gentleman up on the very northern tip of near Cape York and where the Barrier Reef is at its best. We've got some very nice shots associated with the reef, but we're not doing a large segment on the reef, but it will be shown.
What about Cape Tribulation area?
No, we're not. Well, yes, well, actually, the photographs also deal with that, but we're not dealing with some of the issues up there, put it that way.
Have you been there?
Yeah, I have.
It's a lovely area.
Really
it's a superb area.
Yeah. Is that for skin diving and whatnot?
Oh, well, it's a fascinating area, Jack, where you've got the sort of marriage of magnificent rainforest with the Barrier Reef. You've got 2 wonderful areas of natural history coming together, one in the water and one on the land.
He can look at the Great Barrier Reef. If I go back again, I'll go to that wonderful golden...
Oh,
what
Gold Coast.
The Gold Coast.
Oh, yes. That's not the Barrier Reef.
No. He can look at the reef, I'll look at the beautiful women. Oh. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hello?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, I was wondering, I'd like to ask John Landy, is there going to be any koala bears at Expo this year?
We might get the odd one into an audio visual. There'll be no live ones there. That's for sure.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
These are great commercials from Qantas. So. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, John, I just got one question. Welcome to Vancouver.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering, I understand for a number of years your farmers over there had real problems with the rabbit infestation.
Yep.
Causing real serious problems, and I was just wondering how it is now and what they've done to try to overcome it.
Well, it's a very interesting one. It's something I do know a little bit about because I'm a farmer too.
Uh-huh.
Well, look, the problem at the moment is that myxomatosis has been very, very effective. We've introduced the European rabbit flea, which has helped in spreading myxomatosis, the virus which kills rabbits.
Uh-huh.
But unfortunately, we're getting resistance to myxomatosis. There is quite a serious problem right now, in my opinion, in southern Australia. There is a resurgence of the rabbit population. And that could be very serious. When rabbits were at their prime in the 1930s, during the drought and depression years, they were really responsible for greatly reducing the carrying capacity of Australia's grazing lands and also responsible for a tremendous amount of erosion.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a crisis, but it's a worrying situation at the moment.
You'll have to get a new form of myxomatosis.
We either have to do that or a new way of controlling rabbits, but I think myxomatosis, a new strain, would be the way to go, but so far they haven't come up with one to replace the current strain.
Don't you have another
form of genetic breeding at all to create sterile off-breed? Or?
Well, there are a lot of different thoughts at the moment, but quite frankly, I think we're being a little bit foolish in not acting quickly. I think the message really hasn't got home to the community that the rabbits are on the upsurge at the moment.
What about ruse?
Oh, well, that's a problem too, but let me say this, that we've got a lot of ruse on our own property, several hundred of them, and we don't shoot them, but they are a problem in Australia, and I think you've got to get it into perspective. There are an enormous number of ruse. We're only dealing with 3 species. There's the red kangaroo, and there's the eastern grey, and there's the western grey, and there are a whole lot of other species. The endangered species are, in fact, not on the list that are shot at all. But you've got to get this into perspective. There are something like 20 million or of that order of these kangaroos in Australia, and they can breed up enormously quickly. But as a farming problem, in some areas they are very considerable, and it's a very difficult one to handle, both politically and also from a practical point of view. But don't think that these roos are in any danger of extinction, far from it. And they've got enormous capacity to resurge, if you like, after a drought, because one female kangaroo can be associated in 3 ways with a progeny. She can be pregnant, she can have one in the pouch, and she can be running with a young kangaroo simultaneously. And they've got an incredible capacity, once the drought finishes, to breed up again.
Yeah, they drop down during the droughts and then come right
and
back.
The census in 1983, after the drought, suggested there were 19 million in Australia, and they were rising at that time.
A very silly question. Is Australia the only place where there are kangaroos?
Correct.
Not in New Zealand
Can
at
I
all?
just say one thing? Not quite correct. There is a tree kangaroo in New Guinea.
A tree kangaroo?
Yeah, they're a fascinating creature, which a little bit more dumpy, and they're magnificent looking. They're orange in colour with a bit of black on them, and they sit on the branches of trees in tropical forests.
I remember as a kid seeing boxing kangaroos at sideshows in the old country.
Oh, sure, I've seen them in practice actually fighting, and it's quite incredible. They also wouldn't stand up to a Marquis of Queensberry sort of inquiry. They kick.
Okay, John, welcome to Vancouver, and looking forward to watching your exposition down there.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Good.
Go ahead, please, to John Landy.
Yes, I've traveled to Australia, and if I could spend half my life in Vancouver and Sydney summers, of course, I would enjoy it. But when I was up in Surfers Paradise, one question I have to ask is, I noticed all the place names, Palm Beach, Miami Beach, Ilokai Hotel, Islander Hotel. I even went to the store and found a packet of Florida fresh orange juice. And I had to wonder why a country so far away from the United States would take on these names. You can answer.
Well, a very good question. I would entirely agree with you. I don't know why we have to do this, but I guess a lot of our television programs, a lot of our influences come from the United States.
Have you as much American television as we... Not as much as we have.
Well, we have a great deal of influence, and I'm afraid that's the way it goes. And the question is a very good one. I don't know why we need to borrow names from the US or even the United Kingdom at this stage of our career or development.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Mr. Commissioner, good morning, Jack and John.
Good morning.
I enjoyed your country 2 years ago when I went back to visit some of my old Air Force cronies that trained here.
Right.
That's number one. And secondly, I would like to say that there is a World Runners thing on in October, and although you say those old stumps aren't in good shape, how about taking a look at it just for the fun of it? You'd enjoy it.
Well, I'd certainly enjoy looking at it. I don't think I'd enjoy running in it.
Last year in San Diego, there was a couple of old Swiss that were 82 and 83, and a fellow from Taiwan doing the 10K.
Yeah. Well, I've attended the Masters Games last year, and I must admit I was profoundly impressed with what people can and are doing in Masters athletics. I think it's tremendous, but I do think that people have got to be very careful in getting themselves fully trained. Once you get over the age of about 40, you want to be very careful. You can certainly do it, but you need lots and lots of time building up for it.
That's right. You certainly shouldn't smoke at any time, should you?
Not at all.
Go ahead, please.
Two quick questions to the Commissioner. Is Mark Jackson one of your exports? The second question.
Can I guarantee that he is?
You'd be pleased if the Australians could pronounce Canada as Canada rather than Canada. There's no R in it.
I see. Well, I'll take that message back.
No, he's insulting you, John.
Is he?
No, I'm not.
Oh, I'm only joking.
Right.
It's the Englishmen who say Canada and India.
And Mark Jackson.
Oh, Mark Jackson.
Oh, does he say Canada?
Right.
Probably does.
Right.
He was a delightful guest.
Good.
Go ahead, please. Hello.
Morning, Mr. Landy.
Yes, good morning.
I'm leaving for Australia on the 15th of April, and I'm very anxious to know what the weather would be about that time.
Well, it depends where you're going.
Or cold?
Where are you going?
To Sydney.
Oh, Sydney. Oh, it's reasonably warm at that stage. It gets cold in June and July, but it would be quite warm.
I'm glad
you know,
to hear that,
around
'cause this
20
is my
degrees,
first
this sort of
visit,
thing,
I'm
up to
anxious
25 and good days.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, don't forget, when you go to Expo, visit the Australian Pavilion. My thanks to John Landy. Very kind of you to come in this morning
terrific.
and have a pleasant blather to finish up the week's programming. I'll be back after the break. Did you see the, oh, you saw the Globe this morning. Bennett, no Webster.
You haven't seen the Sun yet today.
About whom? Horrible?
No.
I'm so goddamn defensive these days. What do you know? They used a half-decent picture.
Yeah, half-decent pictures, Jack. It's good. You got 20. Yep, 28 seconds.
I've got 28 seconds. What am I doing for Monday? What's George Bowring?
He's a local guy. He's a writer. He's a writer. He's contributed to that book. He's quite an interesting.
On Monday, I'm going to have, among my guests on the program, Jimmy Love, who is the past president of the World Alliance of the YMCA. Don't know why he's coming. Must be something or other. And I'm going to talk about Vancouver, the soul of a city. A couple of people, Gary Geddes and George Bowring, and we'll have a news story of some kind off the top. We've always got to dress up the program. Monday, 9 a.m. precisely.
Muhammad Ali, Jack.
Muhammad Ali.
He wasn't Scottish. Jack doesn't know him unless he wears a skirt.
This is a man.
One's got a deaf and dumb dog, and that's under the table, and the other one's dead, like yourself. Everywhere I walk, oh no, I'm as smooth as a brick in the head.
You remind me of...
And listen, if you're older than 80, you'd be a good partner for Jack.
No, I'm not older than 80.
You're not allowed to push anybody in the back like that from behind. You're not allowed to hit anybody in the side of the head. You're not allowed to trip anybody up from the knee down, and you're not allowed to spit at anybody. And they're the main rules you've got to remember. And of course, I do all of those things because I'm trendy.
Sweetness. God, you're godless.
Expo 86. 42 days to go.
Okay. Okay, let's go. 5
They
seconds.
already have a 5-second generic one, Jack.
Have they got a 5-second generic?
If you got one, we'll just do the 10.
No,
Yeah,
no.
they have.
Okay, we'll just do the 10.
We're just going to do the 10 in the editorial.